Let's get back to our top line story. The market's reacting to the threat from U.S. President Donald Trump that there will be tariffs directed at the Mexican market if we don't see the illegal immigration issue resolved in a more meaningful way, at least according to the president. Flavio Volpe is the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association here in Canada. Just another storyline for your industry to have to navigate through. What was your reaction to the comments from President Trump?
You know, some men just like to watch the world burn, and there is no rhyme or reason to this. You know, we've entered ratification season for the USMCA NAFTA 2.0 in all three countries, and you know, trade is the purview of Congress, and I see this as being another wrinkle in his ability to be able to ratify. Never mind that when you put tariffs on goods that come in from Mexico, you're putting tariffs on goods in our business. American parts made by American companies in Mexico to go into American cars made in the U.S. It's going to hurt the exportability of U.S.-made cars. And by the way, you're putting tariffs on all these cars and parts that are going to be paid by American consumers and American companies. It's just pointing the gun right at his foot.
We actually haven't even asked the question if Trump can do this, given that there is a free trade agreement currently in place between Mexico, U.S., and Canada.
I think we've seen a tempered reaction by the new Mexican president because, of course, that's the reality. And so instead of have a rhetorical fight to see the president firm his resolve, they know they can beat them in a WTO challenge, but those take 18 months. And so it's a function of, look, I think he's using some tempered language to say, you know, what would you like to see? And maybe we can do it without losing face as a government in Mexico. Frankly, it's when you're doing policy by 280 characters, and that policy is about immigration control, there are no objective measures there. It's going to be an interesting month there.
All right, so let's get into the odds business here.
Sure.
I mean, the markets are trying to do some calculations this morning on what ultimately happens in that worst case scenario. Amber was walking us through what's happening with the auto stocks because people are looking at this. If your industry is coming to you today and saying, Flavio, what should we do? What kind of odds do you place on this becoming a reality?
Look, with him, you know, we usually don't bet against him when he's using really blunt instruments like tariffs. They're easy for him to see, maybe not to understand, but he uses them. 65 Canadian companies operate in Mexico, and they sell to Mexican assembly, American assembly, and Canadian assembly. I think he's probably serious in the short term of applying some hurt, but I think this might be his play if we can ascribe any sophistication to this, and that's a big if because he may just be insane. He had always threatened, I'll pull the current NAFTA, I'll start Article 2205, start the 6-month withdrawal in exchange for a USMCA ratification. This might be his play, the same play, using a different instrument. Apply the tariffs, put the pressure on Congress, but I think this Congress may just in fact fight him and put the ratification aside.
We're looking at our Canadian auto parts supplier also selling off on the back of this. But can you flesh out, I mean, obviously this is a spat between Mexico and the United States. And yes, some of our Canadian companies have a presence in Mexico. But if they're not importing into the United States, if some of those things are coming back to Canada, how does all of this play out for Canada?
So, look, this really is a U.S.-Mexico-centric piece. As long as there isn't any spillover into Canada, i.e., the president on a whim decides he's going to use this instrument and then in some new spat that he thinks might be politically expedient, do it on Canada. Canadian firms that supply in Mexico, the Canadian-owned firms with footprints in Mexico sell to Mexican assembly. It's not likely going to affect their operations there. They still have to build the cars. They still got to make them just in time, and no one's going to slow that down. Ultimately, if this thing drags on like the steel and aluminum, if they get applied and it gets dragged on like steel and aluminum tariffs, and it might depress some of the volumes there or have to redirect the export market for those goods, you'll see a little bit of an effect on the prospects of Canadian companies.
Could you have some of the automakers revisit their decisions to close down assembly or manufacturing plants here in Canada? Do you think that these tariffs are severe enough to make them rethink that, or it's so short-term or potentially short-term that they kind of have to grin and bear it?
If you game it out, if what he's threatening is 5% and then an increase of 5 and he gets to his 25% and it's long-term, then of course I think that's also his objective, looking to see some of that production move northward. moving northward, as long as there's a good relationship between Canada and the U.S., could include ostensibly some of that capacity in Ontario. But we're talking that pressure would have to be
so
12 months out. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Canada-U.S. narrative because, and you alluded to it earlier, the comments from Mexico's president today. We spent some time talking about that. Measured comments.
Sure.
In the face of this. What do you think we will hear from the Liberal government, federal government, on this issue? I mean, inevitably they're going to start getting questions on it. What would you like to hear?
I think they're going to be cautious. I think they're not going to say anything. Yesterday there was a good public rapport between the Vice President and the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Talking about each other's prowess in negotiation and then mutual respect. I think this government, we would like to hear them say nothing right now. This is presidential whim. This is ruled by fiat, Twitter fiat. Stay out of it. Offer support, of course, technical policy support maybe to your Mexican colleagues. Share notes. Of course, we're all going through the ratification process, but don't tangle right now.
Yeah, and ratification. I mean, when you made the point about if the Democrats fight him on some of this, which would be a change on some levels,
sure,
but then ratification ends sort of off the main agenda. I mean, does this get us further away from ratification happening before there's a federal election in this country, for example?
I think ratification in this country and in Mexico really rely on ratification process in the U.S. I think both governments, the other two governments, are ready to do it. In the U.S., it was always a kind of a tenuous balance. Throwing some more fuel into the fire here, it can't be helpful. Certainly, if I'm Democrat leadership, I turn to the White House and say, Congress has authority over trade. Pump the brakes. If the president reacts like we've seen him react, I think this might push ratification out of 2019 if we are not careful.
Interesting. All right, Flavio, thanks. Developing story. Good to get your perspective this morning. Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association here in Canada.